September 7th, 1996, Las Vegas, Nevada. A black BMW 750 sits at a red light at the intersection of Flamingo and Koval, custom rims catching the neon from the strip. Behind the wheel is a man who weighs 265 pounds, built like a defensive lineman, because that is exactly what he used to be. In the passenger seat is the biggest rapper alive. The Mike Tyson fight ended 2 hours ago. Tyson won in the first round. The after-party at Club 662 is waiting. And then a white Cadillac pulls alongside the BMW, and someone opens fire. The driver catches a bullet fragment to the head. The passenger takes 4 rounds. 1 pierces a lung. 6 days later, the passenger will be dead, but the man behind the wheel will survive. He will get out of the car, bleeding, unbuckle Tupac Shakur's seatbelt, and drag him out. And here is the detail that tells you everything about this story. The man behind the wheel is the same man who paid to get Tupac out of prison. The same man who built the record label that made Tupac a legend. The same man whose reputation for violence made every room he entered feel like a threat. His name is Marion Hugh Knight, Jr., but nobody has called him that in decades. The world knows him as Suge. And the question this story is really about is not who shot Tupac Shakur. The question is how one man turned fear into a business model, built the most powerful label in hip-hop history, and then watched that same fear eat everything he created from the inside out. To understand Suge Knight, you have to understand Compton in the 1970s and 80s. Not the Compton of the music videos, not the Compton of the mythology, the real one. A city in southern Los Angeles County that had once been a working-class suburb with jobs, churches, small lawns, and families who believed they were building something. By the time Marion Knight Jr. was growing up there, the factories were closing, the jobs were disappearing, and the void was being filled by gangs that offered the only structure a lot of young men could find. The Bloods and the Crips carved Compton into territories. The violence was not abstract. It was the sound you heard outside your window at night. Marion Knight Jr. was the youngest of 3 kids in a 2-bedroom house. His father was a truck driver from Mississippi, a former college football player, and an R&B singer who had never quite made it in the music business, but who never stopped caring about music. His mother was named Maxine. The family called the boy Sugar Bear because of his gentle disposition, and later that got shortened to Suge. There was nothing gentle about the name by the time he was finished with it. But understand this, Suge Knight did not grow up as a gangster. He grew up as an athlete, a big, smart, physically overwhelming athlete who learned very early that being the largest person in the room meant something in Compton that it did not mean in the suburbs. Knight was a gifted athlete. He played football at Linwood High School for 4 years, made a name for himself on the defensive line, and earned a scholarship to the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. At UNLV, he lettered twice, in 1985 and 86. He was smart enough to run hustles on the side. Former associates recall him playing the role of the harmless jock to get free textbooks, then selling them for cash. But the NFL was not in the cards. He went undrafted in 1987, and when the players' strike opened a window for replacement athletes, Knight suited up for 2 games with the Los Angeles Rams. That was the beginning and the end of his professional football career. What came next was more important than anything that happened on a football field. Knight became a bodyguard. He was 6'2", 265 pounds, with hands that could crush a beer can, and a stare that made people change direction on the sidewalk. He worked security for Bobby Brown and other R&B acts on tour, standing backstage, riding in vans, watching the business happen from the closest possible distance without being part of it. And in that position, he saw something that would shape the rest of his life. He saw how the music business really worked. Not the part the public sees, the radio play and the awards and the magazine covers, the other part, the contracts written in language that 20-year-old artists from the projects could not decode. The publishing deals that stripped creators of the one asset worth more than any royalty check. The way managers and label executives skimmed percentages, controlled the accounting, and built mansions while the people making the hits drove rentals. He later described it in blunt terms. He said he watched artists get scammed constantly. A songwriter would hand a demo to a manager, and 2 months later, someone else would be singing the song, and the writer would get nothing, or maybe $1,000 for something worth $500,000. Suge Knight watched all of this, and instead of being disgusted, he took notes. He understood something that most people in the entertainment industry did not want to admit. The music business was not that different from the streets. It ran on leverage. And leverage came from being the person nobody wanted to say no to. The first time the world saw what Suge Knight was willing to do came around 1990, and it involved the most unlikely target imaginable: Vanilla Ice. Robert Van Winkle had the biggest rap-pop crossover hit in the world with Ice Ice Baby. A songwriter and performer named Mario Johnson, who went by the name Chocolate, claimed he had contributed to the track and never received credit or payment. Johnson was managed by Knight. What happened next became one of hip-hop's most repeated legends. According to the story that entered the culture, Suge Knight went to Vanilla Ice's hotel, took him out onto a balcony, and dangled him over the edge until he agreed to sign over publishing rights. Vanilla Ice has disputed the most dramatic version of the story. He acknowledged the intimidation, but denied the literal dangling. The exact details matter less than what the incident accomplished. It established Suge Knight's reputation. He was now viewed as a man who could turn a publishing dispute into a moment of fear. And in the early 90s music industry, that reputation became currency. In a business where artists routinely got trapped in bad contracts and executives fought over rights behind closed doors, Suge offered something different: protection, pressure, a willingness to show up in person and make problems go away or become much worse. That reputation led him to Dr. Dre. By 1990, Dre was the most important producer in West Coast hip-hop, but he was trapped. As the head of production at Ruthless Records, the label founded by Eazy-E and manager Jerry Heller, Dre had produced a string of successful projects. But after Ice Cube left the group NWA in 1989 over money, Dre started looking more carefully at where the profits were going. Suge Knight and another artist called the DOC went over the books with a lawyer and told Dre what he already suspected. The money was not flowing to the people who made the music. Dre wanted out. Eazy-E would not let him go. This is where the legends get darker. According to multiple accounts, Suge Knight arranged a meeting with Eazy-E and used a combination of threats and intimidation to force him to release Dre, the DOC, and singer Michelle A. from their ruthless contracts. The details vary depending on who is telling the story. Some versions involve baseball bats. Some involve threats against Jerry Heller's safety. What is not disputed is the result. Dre got his release, and in 1991, Suge Knight and Dr. Dre, along with the DOC and music executive Dick Griffey, founded Death Row Records. The name itself was a statement. This was not going to be a polite label. It was going to be the hardest, most aggressive outfit in the music business. And the man running it was going to make sure everyone understood that Death Row was not a place where you negotiated. It was a place where you either played by Suge's rules or you dealt with the consequences. But a reputation alone does not sell records. What made Death Row into a juggernaut was the music, and the music was extraordinary. The label secured a distribution deal with Interscope Records, led by Jimmy Iovine, worth an estimated $10 million. That money funded studio time, marketing, and the lifestyle that would become Death Row's calling card. And in December of 1992, Dr. Dre released The Chronic. The album changed everything. It peaked at number 3 on the Billboard 200. It sold nearly 6 million copies in the United States alone. It introduced a sound called G-Funk, built on synthesizer melodies, deep bass grooves, and samples from 1970s funk records layered under Dre's production in a way nobody had heard before. Tracks like Nothing But a G-Thang became anthems that crossed racial and geographic lines. And the album served as a launchpad for a new voice that would define the next phase of West Coast hip-hop. That voice belonged to a 21-year-old from Long Beach named Calvin Brodus, better known as Snoop Dogg. In 1993, Snoop released Doggy Style, produced almost entirely by Dre. The album debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200, selling over 800,000 copies in its first week. It went quadruple platinum. Death Row now had 2 of the biggest artists in the country, a sound that every other label was trying to copy, and a CEO whose reputation made the entire industry nervous. Between The Chronic and Doggy Style, the Above the Rim soundtrack, and the Murder Was the Case project, Death Row was generating tens of millions of dollars. At its peak, some estimates put the label's annual revenue at close to $100 million. The offices on Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles felt less like a record company and more like a fortress. Security everywhere. Red was the color of choice. The atmosphere was a mix of creative intensity and constant low-level menace. The artists flashed the lifestyle in their videos. Custom lowriders, diamond-encrusted Death Row pendants, mansions in the hills. The imagery was deliberate. Death Row was not just selling music. It was selling a fantasy of unchecked power, of young black men from neighborhoods that the rest of America ignored, suddenly having more money, more influence, and more visibility than anyone knew what to do with. And standing behind all of it, making sure everyone remembered who was really in charge, was Suge Knight in all red, repping his hometown Mob Piru Bloods, a physical presence so imposing that people in the industry described meetings with him the way you would describe being in a room with a wild animal. Not because he was always violent, but because you were never sure when he might be. The money flowed, the hits kept coming, and the rest of the industry watched Death Row with a mixture of envy and dread. Other labels tried to copy the G-Funk sound. Nobody could copy the aura. Because the aura was not about the music, it was about the man. And the man was becoming convinced that he was untouchable. If you enjoy stories where what looks like an unstoppable empire already carries the seeds of its own destruction, subscribe to this channel. Because the problem with building a business on fear is that fear does not stay pointed in one direction. And what Suge Knight did next turned a regional rivalry into a national crisis. August 3rd, 1995. The Source Awards at the Paramount Theater in Madison Square Garden, New York City. This was supposed to be a celebration of hip-hop. Instead, it became the night the East Coast-West Coast War went public. Suge Knight walked to the microphone to accept the award for Best Movie Soundtrack for Above the Rim. He was draped in red. Standing next to him was Danny Boy, a young death row R&B singer. And instead of thanking anyone, Suge said this: "Any artist out there that wants to be an artist and stay a star and does not have to worry about the executive producer trying to be all in the videos, all on the records, dancing, come to Death Row." Everyone in the room knew exactly who he was talking about. Sean Combs, known then as Puff Daddy, the founder of Bad Boy Records. Puffy's signature move was inserting himself into his artists' songs and videos, dancing alongside them, ad-libbing over their tracks. It was his brand, and Suge had just publicly mocked it on Puffy's home turf in front of the entire industry. The crowd erupted. The New York audience booed every West Coast act that appeared on stage for the rest of the night. When Snoop Dogg got up to present, he asked the crowd a question that sounded casual, but carried the weight of a declaration of war. "You all do not love us. Then let it be known." People who were in that room described the atmosphere as dangerous. There were fights in the audience. One person who attended later said they felt like a bomb was about to go off. The tension between the East Coast and West Coast had been building for years, fueled by competition, regional pride, and a media that loved the narrative of a rap civil war. But the Source Awards took all of that simmering hostility and turned it into a public confrontation that neither side could walk back from. And Suge Knight was not finished escalating. Within months, he made a move that turned Death Row from the most feared label in the country into something that looked more like a dynasty. He went after Tupac Shakur. In the fall of 1995, Tupac was locked up in Clinton Correctional Facility in upstate New York, serving a sentence on sexual assault charges he insisted he was innocent of. He was broke. His legal options were running out. He had been signed to Interscope, but the label did not know what to do with a convicted artist sitting in a prison cell. Nobody in the mainstream music business was willing to touch him. Suge Knight saw something different. He saw the most electrifying performer in hip-hop at his lowest point, available for a price that would never come around again. Knight visited Tupac in prison and made him an offer. Death Row would post his bail, which came to $1.4 million. In exchange, Tupac would sign a 3-album deal with the label. The power dynamic was completely one-sided. Tupac was behind bars. Suge had the checkbook. A corrections officer who witnessed the signing later recalled Tupac showing him the contract with obvious excitement. The officer told him to be careful, that he might have just sold his soul. But Tupac saw it differently. He felt abandoned by the East Coast. He believed that the industry figures he had trusted, from Puffy to others, had formed a cabal against him. In Suge, he saw someone who was willing to go to war for him, someone who would fight the fights that the polished executives would not. On October 12, 1995, 8 days after signing the formal contract with Interscope, Tupac walked out of Clinton Correctional Facility. A white limousine was waiting. He boarded a private jet to Los Angeles and went straight to the studio. What followed was one of the most intense creative periods in the history of recorded music. Tupac had spent months in a prison cell reading political philosophy, writing lyrics on legal pads. building up a reservoir of rage and ambition that had nowhere to go. The moment he stepped into the studio in Los Angeles, all of it came pouring out. He recorded at a pace that stunned even the seasoned engineers and producers around him. Multiple songs a day, verse after verse, sometimes recording a complete track in a single take. The prison had not broken him. It had compressed him, like fuel in a cylinder waiting for a spark. The result was All Eyes on Me, a double-disc album, the first in hip-hop history, released in February 1996. It debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200, stayed there for 2 weeks, and eventually sold over 10 million copies, earning diamond certification from the Recording Industry Association of America. Tracks like California Love, featuring Dr. Dre and Roger Troutman, became anthems that transcended hip-hop and entered the mainstream on a level that few rap songs had reached before. The album was a portrait of a man who felt he was living on borrowed time and wanted to record everything he had left inside him before the clock ran out. Death Row now had Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and Tupac Shakur on the same roster. People in the industry compared it to assembling a super team. The most stacked lineup in the history of rap, all under one roof, all under the control of one man. On paper, it looked invincible. But the cracks were already there if you knew where to look. But here is where the cracks started showing. Dr. Dre was already pulling away. He was tired of the chaos. Tired of the violence that followed Death Row everywhere. Tired of Suge Knight's management style, which treated artists less like partners and more like property. In 1996, Dre left Death Row and founded Aftermath Entertainment. The genius who had built the label's sound walked out the door, and Suge let him go, apparently unconcerned. He had Tupac now. He had Snoop. What did he need Dre for? That was the first major miscalculation. The second was the East Coast-West Coast war itself. What had started as competitive trash talk between Death Row and Bad Boy Records had mutated into something genuinely dangerous. Diss tracks, public threats, allegations that each side was involved in real violence against the other. The media covered it like a sporting event, but underneath the headlines, real people were in real danger. And Suge Knight was stoking the flames, not because he had a specific endgame, but because conflict was his natural operating mode. The man who had built his career on intimidation could not stop intimidating. Every room he entered, every interview he gave, every public appearance was another opportunity to project dominance. Here is the question that defined the middle of this story, and it is the question I want to leave with you. Was Suge Knight a brilliant businessman who understood something about power that the rest of the industry refused to acknowledge? Or was he a man who confused the ability to make people afraid with the ability to make something last? Was Death Row's peak an example of ruthless pragmatism, or was it always a house built on sand? Leave your verdict in the comments, because what happened next in Las Vegas changed everything. September 7th, 1996. We are back at the night where this story began, but now you understand what was at stake. Tupac and Suge arrived in Las Vegas to watch Mike Tyson fight Bruce Seldon at the MGM Grand. They had front row seats. Tyson won in the first round, a knockout that lasted less than 2 minutes. The crowd was electric. Tupac and Tyson embraced near the ring. And then, in the MGM Grand lobby, it fell apart. A Death Row associate named Trayvon Lane spotted a man named Orlando Anderson near the elevators. Anderson was a member of the Southside Compton Crips, a rival gang to Suge's mob Piru Bloods. Lane told Tupac that Anderson had recently stolen a death row chain from him at a mall. Tupac rushed Anderson. The entire death row entourage joined in. Security cameras captured Tupac and Suge kicking and punching Anderson on the casino floor. They left the MGM Grand and headed for Club 662, a venue Suge owned in Las Vegas. Suge drove the BMW. Tupac rode shotgun. The entourage followed in a convoy of other vehicles. At approximately 11:15 that night, they stopped at a red light at the intersection of Flamingo and Koval. A white Cadillac pulled up on the passenger side. Someone in the back seat opened fire. Tupac was hit 4 times. Suge caught a bullet fragment to the head. He managed to make a U-turn and drive toward the hospital. Tupac was alive when they arrived, but in critical condition. He underwent multiple surgeries. 6 days later, on September 13, 1996, Tupac Shakur was pronounced dead at University Medical Center of Southern Nevada. He was 25 years old. The man who had been sitting next to him survived with minor injuries, but the empire did not. The aftermath of Tupac's death was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. The most important artist on the roster was gone. The creative engine was silent, and the man who might have held it all together was about to lose his freedom. Suge Knight was already on probation from a 1992 assault conviction. The MGM Grand Brawl, the one where he and Tupac and the death row entourage beat Orlando Anderson on the casino floor, was captured on surveillance cameras. Crystal clear footage. A textbook probation violation. In 1997, a judge sentenced him to 9 years in prison. With Suge locked up, death row lost its center of gravity. Snoop Dogg, who had been loyal to the label through years of controversy, finally walked away. He later said the environment had become toxic, that the music was secondary to the drama. Other artists followed. The producers moved on. The Interscope distribution deal, which had been the financial backbone of the operation, was effectively over. Jimmy Iovine, the man who had bankrolled death row's rise, was already investing his energy elsewhere. By the time Suge got out in 2001, death row was a ghost of what it had been. The office still existed. The name still carried weight in conversations about hip-hop history. But the catalog was the only thing generating revenue, and even that was tangled in lawsuits, disputed royalties, and years of what a federal judge would later call gross mismanagement. The industry had moved on to a new generation. Eminem, Jay-Z, 50 Cent. The centers of power in hip-hop had shifted, and nobody was waiting for Suge Knight to come back and reclaim his throne. But Suge could not let go. He tried to keep the label alive through posthumous Tupac releases and compilations of unreleased material. He launched smear campaigns against the artists who had left. He got into more legal trouble. In 2003, he was sent back to prison for punching a parking lot attendant at a Hollywood nightclub. Another probation violation, another stretch behind bars. And then the lawsuits came. A woman named Lydia Harris, who claimed she had helped found Death Row as a silent partner, won a judgment of $107 million against Knight and the label. Unable to pay, Death Row Records and Suge Knight simultaneously filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in April of 2006. A federal judge eventually ordered a trustee takeover, citing gross mismanagement. The label that had once generated tens of millions of dollars a year was now drowning in debt exceeding $100 million. Death Row was auctioned off. The label that had once been valued at over $100 million sold for $18 million to a Toronto-based company called Wide Awake Entertainment. Think about that number for a moment. $18 million. For a catalog that included The Chronic, Doggy Style, All Eyes on Me, and dozens of other projects. For the brand that had defined an entire era of American music. $18 million. That is what fear was worth once the man behind it lost his ability to enforce it. Wide Awake went bankrupt within a few years. The label passed to a company called Entertainment One, later known as E1. Then E1 was acquired by Hasbro. Yes, that Hasbro, the toy company, the people who make Transformers and My Little Pony. The label that had launched Dr. Dre and Tupac Shakur, the label whose logo was a man strapped to an electric chair, was now sitting in the intellectual property portfolio of a corporation that sells action figures to children. If you wrote that in a screenplay, the studio would send it back and tell you it was too on the nose. And Suge Knight was not finished destroying himself. And then came the final act, the one that no screenwriter could have invented because it was too perfectly, grotesquely ironic. On January 29, 2015, a crew was filming promotional material for the movie Straight Outta Compton, the NWA biopic that told the story of the very world Suge Knight had helped create and then helped destroy. The shoot was happening near locations in Compton. Knight had heard that the film was going to portray him negatively, which it did. The movie included scenes of his character pistol whipping people and using violence to control artists. Suge drove to the area to confront Dr. Dre, who was a producer on the film. He was turned away from the production base camp. Nobody wanted him there. An argument broke out nearby at a burger stand called Tam's, a Compton institution owned by a local businessman named Terry Carter. Carter was 55 years old, a successful man who built custom lowriders, who was known and respected in the community, and who, by all accounts, was a friend of Knight's. He had come to the scene, apparently, to help calm things down. Surveillance cameras captured what happened next. Knight was driving a red Ford F-150 Raptor. He got into a confrontation with Clee Sloan, known as Bone, who was working security for the film set. The truck reversed, knocking Sloan to the ground. Then it pulled forward, running directly over Terry Carter. Knight drove away. Carter died at the scene. He was 55 years old. Knight turned himself in and was charged with murder, attempted murder, and hit and run. He claimed self-defense, saying he was trying to flee after being attacked. Prosecutors argued he intentionally floored the truck. In September of 2018, days before his trial was finally set to begin after years of delays, Knight pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 28 years in state prison. The man who had once been the most powerful figure in hip-hop, the CEO who had stood next to Tupac and Snoop and Dre, the executive who made the entire music industry flinch when he walked into a room, was now an inmate at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego. He will not be eligible for parole until 2034 at the earliest. And the label he built. In February of 2022, Snoop Dogg, the artist Suge had once signed to Death Row, the man who had made Doggy Style in Suge's studio, announced that he had acquired the Death Row Records brand. The artist outlasted the mogul. The company that Suge had built through intimidation, now belonged to one of the people he had tried to control. For stories where the real winner is decided not by who has the most power, but by who knows when to stop using it, subscribe and turn on notifications. But this story ends where it began. A car, a passenger seat, Las Vegas, 1996. Suge Knight got out of that BMW with blood running down his face, went around to the other side, unbuckled Tupac's seatbelt, and pulled him out. In that moment, whatever else he was a man trying to save someone he cared about. But every other moment in this story tells a different truth. The empire he built was never designed to protect anyone. It was designed to project power. And power, when it has no restraint, no limit, no ability to recognize the moment when enough becomes too much, does not build dynasties. It builds wreckage. Suge Knight sits in a prison cell in San Diego. The label is owned by Snoop. Dre went on to sell Beats headphones to Apple for $3 billion. Tupac is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The music survived. The man who believed he was bigger than the music did not. Death Row Records was never just a record label. It was an experiment. An answer to the question, what happens when you run a music company the way you run a street corner? And the answer, after all the platinum records, after all the money, after the shootings and the funerals and the courtrooms, turned out to be exactly what everyone who was paying attention always knew it would be. The same thing that always happens. The corner runs out.